killing its own people in such mass numbers, civilians, people who were receiving treatment in a hospital just to get international sympathy. Could this be potentially the turning point in this 10-day-old war? But first, I want to bring you up to speed with this whole clash of narratives that's happening. But before we get to that, the story of the day so far.
About a week ago, made a statement in which he said, evacuate the hospitals are target, and in fact they hit one hospital a week ago. So their intentions is evacuate or hospitals will be hit, and they are responsible for that crime, and they cannot fabricate stories to deal with it.
We confirmed that there was no IDF fire by land, sea or air that hit the hospital. Second, our radar system tracked rockets fired by terrorists from within Gaza at the time of the explosion.
بقول لك أول مرة بنشوف الصاروخ زي هيك والشظايا هذه، فبقول لك تبع الجهاد الصواريخ الجهاد الإسلامي. إيه؟ فهم بقولوا تعاون الجهاد الإسلامي. من علمنا هذا؟ شكل من علمنا. مين اللي بيقول هيك؟ بيحكوا إن الشظايا تبعت الصاروخ إن الشظايا محلية مش زي شظايا إيش بتقول؟
Explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday, and based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there who are not sure. So we've got to overcome a lot of things.
And just as the civilized world united to defeat the Nazis and united to defeat ISIS, the civilized world must unite to defeat Hamas. I can assure you, Mr. President, Israel is united to defeat Hamas. And we will defeat Hamas and remove this terrible threat from our lives.
All right, so this Gaza hospital attack, there's a clash of narratives, clash of claims and counterclaims. Now, this is what Palestine's charge is, that the IDF thought that the hospital was a Hamas base and that's where they attacked it. Israel has countered that by saying if this was indeed an air-to-ground strike by Israeli aircraft, then no craters have been found, which is consistent with an airstrike. There'll be massive craters if this was an air-to-ground missile. The Palestinian charge is that Israel is changing its story only to shift the blame back to Hamas and to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad groups. Meanwhile, Israel's counter is also this rocket attack was not so powerful that there was any structural damage to nearby buildings. If it was an air-to-ground strike, then there would be massive damage to the neighborhood. Palestine's charge is that the IDF had specifically said that people need to evacuate this particular hospital. This order, in fact, came just a couple of days ago. Israel's counter is that Hamas realized that it was a rocket that Hamas itself had fired, which misfired and hit the hospital building. The charge from the Palestinians that Israel is responsible for the deaths of 500 civilians who were receiving treatment in the hospital. The counter from Israel is that Hamas is doing this campaign to inflate the death toll. Now, no matter which side you believe, the Israeli side or the Hamas side, fact of the matter is that it got a huge fillip. The Israeli side and their claim got a huge fillip when Joe Biden, the US president, was in Israel and tended to agree that it was not carried out by the Israeli side, but by what he said was the other team. Let's listen into what Joe Biden said, and then I'll go across to our guests.
Americans are agreeing with you. They really are. And Americans are worried. Americans are worried because they know this is not an easy field to navigate, what you have to do. Explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there who are not sure. So we've got to overcome a lot of things.
Let's get to the big debate tonight here on Brass Tacks. Is the Gaza hospital bombing a turning point in this conflict?
Hello, Moto.
All right, let me go across to our guests who are now joining us. I'll be joined in a moment by Daniel Carman. He's a former Israeli ambassador to India. Rohan Gunaratne is an author and security expert. Ashok Sajanhar, former diplomat, joining us. And Raymond Vikri is author and advisor on US-India ties. Raymond Vikri, let me start with you first, because there's this fog of war and it's becoming increasingly difficult to establish who was behind that attack on the hospital. But today, President Biden was in Tel Aviv and he said, from whatever he has seen, it appears that that bombing was carried out by the other team, his words, and not by you, meaning Israel. So how much of a fillip does that give to Israel's claim, the IDF's claim? And now that Biden has said this publicly, do you believe it's also bases independent assessments by the Pentagon, by US intelligence, and not just going by what the Israelis have claimed?
Well, thanks very much for having me. This indeed is a very serious turning point, I believe. I want to step back and say how extraordinary it is for a president of the United States to go to a war zone. And I believe that President Biden is doing this basically for one reason, and that is to try to keep the war from spreading, and particularly getting Iran and its proxies into the war. So I think his message is one, yes, support for the Israelis in the face of what is obviously a terrorist attack. Terrorism has been a focus of the government of India as well as the U.S. And Israel. But two, to try to open up a corridor for relief. He has announced just a few minutes ago additional funds and progress in terms of opening to Egypt for this. But there's no question that it seems that the whole narrative that this was Israeli bombing of this hospital is coming unraveled. You've seen the video. The video shows a great flame, which is not consistent with the kind of strike and aftermath that you would have from missiles. Mm-hmm. I would also point out that this is a Christian-run hospital, and so there is that aspect to it. I think it's circumstantial, but you have to look at who does this benefit. President Biden is there to try to keep the war from spreading, to minimize casualties. And this strike, it really blows a serious damage into that. Now, who benefits from that? It's not Israel that benefits from that. It seems to me it's clearly Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and those who want to widen the war. The cancellation of the face-to-face meeting, of course, is a setback, and so I think you have to look at it from that perspective as well.
So, Rohan Gunaratne, before I get to whether this will spread into a regional war, what happens to Biden's efforts to try and contain this between Israel and Hamas, and of course, Raymond Vikri is right. He was supposed to go to Jordan, meet with the leaders of Jordan, Egypt, and Palestinian Authority. That's not happening as a consequence of it. I'll get to all of that in 1 second. But I want to understand from you, in your long years as a security affairs expert, as a counter-terror expert, from whatever pictures you've seen in the public domain, the argument that if this were carried out by Israeli forces and if this was an air-to-ground missile attack, then you would see large craters there, which we're not seeing at this point of time. Does that argument hold for you? That alone would prove to you that this was not an air-to-ground Israeli rocket or an Israeli missile which caused the attack of the hospital, but this was something likely from the ground, from the Palestinian side, from the Gazan side?
The attack was very clearly mounted by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Both SIGINT, the signals intelligence and imagery intelligence that the Israelis have released confirms this. If anyone has any doubt, they should look at the imagery and the signals intelligence that has been made public. And if anyone wants to further investigate, they can ask the technical experts, either of Britain or the United States or any other country, to ask other parties to present evidence. Today, over the Gaza Strip, there are so many satellites. And I want you to know that if the Israelis did it, it was very counterproductive, because this is the time we can prevent this Gaza conflict from becoming a regional conflict. And that has been effectively derailed by the attack on this hospital, because the Arab street is today calling the shots. And I think that the party that did this attack has to take full responsibility for it.
So I think to that extent, let me bring in Daniel Carman into this conversation, former Israeli ambassador to India. When President Biden, just a day before he left, the initial plan was that he would come to Tel Aviv, he would meet with Benjamin Netanyahu, and then he would go to Jordan. He would meet with the King of Jordan, he would meet with the Egyptian president, the Palestinian Authority president. But that second leg of his visit got completely cancelled in the aftermath of this hospital attack. So what are the hopes and what are the realistic assessments of this war being contained into a conflict between Israel and Hamas and not spreading into the wider Arab world? Because right now, as Rohan Gunaratne said a moment ago, the mood on the Arab street seems to be no reconciliation. If this is going to be a wider war, then so be it. Does Israel want a wider war? Is Israel ready for a wider regional conflict?
Of course, there is this fear, and minutes ago someone of my predecessors here talked about a turning point. I think we should go back to the facts, and some of the facts were mentioned here before about what I don't call it an attack on the hospital. I would call it a failed launch of a terrorist attack intended towards Israel. There are all the circumstances that can show it, including the photographic evidence on the crater, that there is no crater, a phone conversation when practically two Hamas people were talking with each other, asking each other, what was it? Was it bombing by the Israelis? And then a Hamas guy says to another Hamas guy, it's not the Israelis. The Israelis don't work with such kind of ammunition. It is the others, the Islamic Jihad. And Israel could react immediately saying it's not us, but we waited, the IDF spokesperson waited for an hour. After checking, gave the bottom line of this failed terrorist launch. And I have to add a data maybe that is not known. During those 10, 11 days, more than 450 rockets launched from terrorist Gaza towards Israel fell into Gazan territory out of a few thousands that were launched towards Israel. So it's a huge number, and any one of those can, be defined as an Israeli attack. But Israel does not bomb areas such as hospitals or around mosques or around schools unless they are part of, the human shield apparatus.
So let me ask Ashok Sajjanhar. So even if this happened inadvertently by the Palestinian terrorists, by the Hamas terrorists firing rockets into Israel, and one of it inadvertently hit this hospital building, it does beg the question, Ashok Sajjanhar, what sort of grouping which claims to represent a set of people would go to the extent of killing their own 500 civilians who were receiving treatment inside a hospital building? What sort of group goes to that extent for this kind of mass killing just to gain international sympathy? I mean, I can't think of, the IRA or the LTTE. They may have killed individual cases in one or two or a few dozen cases, but 500 at one go in a civil hospital, I mean, I find it hard to wrap my head around that. What does it say
No,
about that particular group?
You're very right, Zaka. I think this is quite unimaginable. And, this is, I think two scenarios have been presented. One is that it could have happened by mistake, by chance, that, it has gone and it has struck this hospital, as has been the case with several other rockets. They can misfire and they can go there. And of course, they are trying to make the most of this mistake that they have done. And of course, they have a very credulous and readily believing audience globally that it would have been done by Israel. The second is that they would have done it intentionally, and that of course is very, very evil. Intentionally to get international support, because they know that whether it is Israel or it is the West or it is the United States, they are under pressure. So, making sacrifice of some of these 500 of these people, well, that is, a just cause for this. We have seen how these Hamas terrorists, they have, butchered, they have massacred the people in the south of Israel, how they have come across and they have killed them. So I think and we know that they do not, the Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, they do not represent the interests of the Palestinian people. And those who have been claiming that it could have been done by, or it would have been done by Israel, I don't buy that argument at all. Okay. Because I think it would be definitely, it would be politically and strategically very harmful, very damaging, and very immature on the part of Israel.
So how does one sort of separate what has happened on the battlefield and this whole fog of war completely clouding propaganda, if you will? I want to ask Raymond Vickery this, because not just this hospital story, in the immediate aftermath, there was one set of people who came out and said, oh, Israel's done it and somebody needs to put guardrails on what Israel's doing. Israel can't have this kind of carte blanche, as it were, as it got over the last 10 days to go into Gaza and do whatever it pleases in response to the terror attack that happened on Israeli soil on 7th of October. And yet, we also saw last week the whole story of the beheading of the babies. Again, there was a group of people who came out and said that, look, this is what Hamas has done. The Israeli Defense Forces came out with some kind of proof for the decapitation of these babies, and yet people were not willing to believe. They were saying that, this is the state saying so, and they will say whatever they want to justify an imminent Gazan invasion. How does one separate in this fog of war, Raymond Vickery, what is true and what isn't? Because both sides are playing the propaganda game.
Well, there's no question about that, but there has to be some modicum of trying to discern what the facts are. And I believe the President of the United States doesn't make the kind of statements that he's made about he thinks it was the other team without some basis. And your analysts have looked at the pictures. You see that it's flames which are inconsistent with the air-to-ground strike, and there are other indications. Now, there's nothing positive that you can say. There is the fog of war, but we have to realize that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are really adherents to the sort of ISIS terrorist approach, and that no atrocity is too great if it serves the cause of the terrorists. India has been fighting terrorism for these many, many years. The Prime Minister has said that this is not a time for war. So there is an attempt, at least on the part, I know, of the United States to be able to sort out fact from fiction. Do you have definitive proof? No, you don't. But again, I would say you have to look at who benefits from this kind of atrocity. It's certainly not those like President Biden and others who want to keep the war from spreading. It's those who want to spread it as much as it can and have an ideology which includes it's all right to behead babies or kill grandmothers and mothers, so long as you're able to put forth the agenda of the terrorist.
So Daniel Carmen, you have a unique situation here where on the one hand, it is now becoming apparent through evidence, whether it's phone intercepts or through pictures that have been taken, that it's likelier, and even the US president has said this, it's likelier that it was carried out by Hamas or by Palestinian terrorists and not by the Israeli Defense Forces. And yet, the mood on the Arab street across the Arab world is so incensed by what happened at the Gaza hospital yesterday that they want nothing short of blood, of Israeli blood. So much so, the King of Jordan cancelled the US president's meetings with him, with the Egyptian leader, and with the president of the Palestinian Authority. How do you reconcile the two? Israel also has an interest in making sure that this doesn't become a wider regional conflict with the rest of the Arab world. But the Arab street wants to make it so, and it seems to be moving in that direction, at least from the mood on the street, whether it's in Cairo or in Amman or in other parts of the Arab world.
Israel has
Daniel Carmen, thank you.
Yes, I must go back to your previous question because I cannot accept the terminology saying that both sides are playing the propaganda game. What happened to our people, our elderly, babies, mothers, people with on wheelchairs in the middle of a festival. You all saw the videos and you saw much more than we do because they are not broadcast fully in Israel because of sensitivity. What happened here is a manslaughter, and I cannot accept that this is put under the headline of propaganda game. I'm part of a forum of families of missing hostages and missing families forum. I hear the people who don't know where 200 of their relatives are kept in captivity by a terrorist organization. Some have been killed, probably. Some have been burned. This is not a propaganda game, guys. This is not a propaganda game. This is an atrocity that you can.
No, but Mr. Carmen, I'm sorry about the choice of words, but it is also equally true that a number of Palestinian civilians have also died in the Israeli airstrikes over the last 10 days. In fact, the numbers, and I'm never a believer of comparing numbers and numbers, but the fact is there are like more than 4,000 Palestinians who've died in the last 10 days compared to 1,400 Israelis. And you can go back to any number of wars that have been fought in the last 30 years. The proportion of Palestinians who've died at Israeli hands, Israeli airstrikes and Israeli mortar fire is far more than Israeli civilians. I'm not saying that that's a justification, but fact is that civilians have died on the other side as well, and in large numbers.
Of course, we will never compare numbers, and we will never apologize for having an Iron Dome that does not let any of those thousands of rockets. I'm sitting here in the safe room. Yesterday, I was here for three or four different periods of time because of rockets. So we will not apologize for having technology. But that's a war. It's a fierce war that was declared on my country. My country is fighting a war.
Okay.
President Biden has repeated more than once, and we hear him, that democracy should be fighting within the limits of the international law, and that's clear, and that's
absolutely
always been the case. But
absolutely, I think that is the limited point, that democracies have to function within international law. Even if they are going to war, there are Geneva Conventions where civilians can't be targeted. There are rules of war, but we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I know it's a difficult situation. You've had the worst terror attack on your soil. You also are confronted with an enemy that is using civilians as human shields to hide the terrorists. So it's not an easy task. Let's make absolutely no mistake about it. But having said that, the pressure on the international community, the pressure on Israel is to ensure that there are guardrails that civilians are not targeted just indiscriminately, and that this is not allowed to spread into a wider regional conflict, which is exactly what Hamas wants, which is exactly what Hezbollah and Iran want, and which is the last thing that Israel or any of its friends or well-wishers need. But let me go across and try and get a sense of how this story has sort of really become a bit of a turning point, because there's also shifting sands, as it were, on this story. Now, when this happened yesterday, the hospital attack, Joe Biden, before leaving for Israel, called it an act of pure evil. He said he was outraged by what happened. Today in Tel Aviv, and after having reviewed all the footage and all the information that was made available to him, he says it looks like the bombing was carried out by the other team. You had Rishi Sunak, who's due to go to Israel. He's likely going to be there on Thursday. The massacre by Hamas, and we stand with Israel, is what he had said earlier. Now he's sort of changed that stand a tad bit to say that we need to recognize the consequences of a wider conflict. The entire Western world is aware of, very cognizant of this spreading into a wider conflict. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, saying we stand with Israel in their time of need. This was in the immediate aftermath of the hospital bombing. Now he says that humanitarian laws must be respected in Gaza. Now, these are some of the staunchest allies of Israel who are sort of measuring their statements just a bit in the last 24 hours or so. You also saw what Olaf Scholz just said. Let me now go across to a special guest who is joining us. He's been a former minister, holding multiple portfolios in the past governments in Israel. Yossi Beilin. Thank you very much, Mr. Beilin, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. First things first, now it's increasingly appearing that the attack on the hospital in Gaza was done by Palestinian terrorists, whether it was Hamas or whether it was Islamic Jihad, that we will get to. But after Biden said what he said, that it seems to have been carried out by the other team, what is the assessment in Israel? There is this imminent ground invasion, and yet there is pressure on Israel to ensure that civilians are not targeted indiscriminately, and yet you have to deal with an enemy that's using civilians as human shields. So how are you going to go about it?
Well, first of all, it is a tragedy, and civilians were killed. We don't know the number, but any number is too big, and we are very sorry for that. Yesterday, when we first heard the news, it was, of course, very embarrassing. But then we saw the proof, we saw the pictures, which are very, very clear, and which were given, by the way, by one of the TV channels, and shows that the missile was shot from Gaza, not from Israel. And apparently it was a failed missile which was shot by the Islamic Jihad. So on the one hand, we are really appalled by the event itself, but it was not Israel.
But Mr. Beilin, now as a consequence of this, the mood on the Arab street, whether it is in Cairo, whether it is in Amman, whether it is in Riyadh, seems to be one of anger and retribution, even if Israel is not the one that carried out this attack on the hospital. And yet, it's also in Israel's interest to make sure that this is a localized conflict between Hamas and Israel without spreading into a wider regional Israel versus Arab kind of conflict. How do you ensure that that happens?
Well, I'm not sure that it is so easy to ensure something like that. You are right that in describing the Israeli interest to focus on Hamas only. And if in the past I was one of those who said don't enter on a ground attack, it will cost too much for both sides. Let us find some kind of a solution, ceasefire, any kind of a common denominator with Hamas, but this is not the situation right now. We cannot continue and live these lives that every few months Hamas finds another excuse in order to launch missiles against us, to shoot the different areas of Tel Aviv, or different areas of Haifa, other places. It's crazy. It's crazy.
What do you think is going to happen now, Mr. Beilin? We know that a ground invasion is imminent. Israel has called in like 300,000 reservists. You have to,
Right.
it is going to be a street to street, building to building, almost, block to block kind of fighting that's going to happen over the next few weeks and months. And that's where the possibility of civilian damage, civilian casualties is also very high. And more the number of civilian casualties, Israel loses the moral high ground that it has right now. So how do you go about that difficult task?
We must replace Hamas. They cannot go on and continue to lead the Gaza Strip. And the best way is to offer Gaza back to the Palestinian Authority. It's not for Israel. Israel should not remain in Gaza, should not occupy Gaza, but get out of it once the military operation is out. If it is possible to convince the Palestinian Authority to get back to Gaza, because it was taken from them in 2007 by force, by the Hamas people. So if they are ready now to return to Gaza and take it upon itself, then I believe that Israel should be part of the different forces in the world which will help the Gazians to rehabilitate this strip.
And I want to get one final word from you about, the Palestinian Authority. At some point, whenever this military operation concludes and Israel may be successful in eliminating Hamas, you believe that the Palestinian Authority could fill that vacuum. But the Palestinian Authority has lost all credibility, at least in the Gaza Strip, over the last 10 or 15 years that Hamas was there. Why do you believe that Palestinian Authority or Fatah might replace the vacuum that will be left behind once Hamas is eliminated?
First of all, I'm not sure that we are going to eliminate Hamas and that it is realistic. What is realistic, I believe, is to replace the leadership. But about the Palestinian Authority, of course, there are many disadvantages of this authority. It is not a real success story, but it is better than all the other options. The Palestinians are the only ones who really want the Gaza Strip, because there are 2 million Palestinians living there. And it is the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority and of the PLO to assure that the Palestinians return to normal life in Gaza. So it is difficult. I know. I don't want to put myself in their shoes, but nevertheless, I think that they should be convinced that once we are out, that they are in.
All right, Yossi Beilin, thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Thank you for your time. And finally, as we wrap up this segment and before we go to our next segment, let's go to our Motorola, India's best 5G smartphone brand's tweet of the day.
Hello, Moto.
All right, so the tweet of the day, United Nations has tweeted that even wars have rules and everyone must respect them during conflict and help ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those who are in need without any discrimination. That is our Motorola 5G tweet of the day. All right, up next, there's a deep dive into the Israel-Hamas conflict. Could it lead to greater destabilization in the region? And more importantly, now that Hezbollah is firing rockets into northern Israel, is Israel ready for a two-front war? That and more coming up right on the other side of this quick break.
Hello, Moto. We have seen a devastating loss of innocent life since the attacks on Israel by the terrorist group Hamas. But the scenes from the explosion at a Gaza city hospital are deeply distressing, and it is clear that there has been a devastating loss of life. Every innocent life matters, whether it is Israeli or Palestinian. Our thoughts are with those killed, those injured, and their loved ones. The protection of civilian lives must come first, as the Parliament said in its resolution that we carried on Monday. And respect for international humanitarian law is paramount. We condemn any indiscriminate attacks and targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals. And Australia joins with others in calling for international law to always be upheld.
Thank you very much.
In a tragic incident that has shocked the entire world, the al-ahli hospital in Gaza has been struck, leaving more than 500 civilians dead. A major back and forth has erupted between the Gazan authorities and the Israeli Defense Forces over who takes responsibility for this devastating attack. The IDF has asserted that the strike resulted from Palestinian Hamas rockets gone awry, misfiring and then tragically hitting the hospital. Israeli authorities, whether it is the IDF spokespeople right up to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, are all insisting that they possess confirmed evidence pointing to a misfired Palestinian rocket which led to the catastrophe. In response, US President Joe Biden has expressed his outrage over the incident. Hamas has claimed that this was an air-to-ground strike and they do not have in their possession weaponry which can cause such widespread damage, and that too to a multi-story building. They claim that Israel used American-made missiles to carry out the air-to-ground strike on the al-ahli hospital. But Israel has denied these claims. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said that there were no Air Force, ground or naval attacks in the area at the time of this blast at the hospital. He said that radar detected outgoing rocket fire at that exact same time and intercepted communication between militants which indicated that Hamas was behind the attack. This unfortunate event unfolds just a day before President Biden was scheduled to land in Tel Aviv for what would be his first visit since this war began. His planned trip also included visits to Jordan, meetings with the Jordanian king, King Abdullah, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Egyptian president, General Sisi. However, this itinerary has been abruptly cancelled in the wake of the hospital attack. Now the United States has confirmed that Biden will not be traveling to Jordan. His only stop will be Tel Aviv. The US now faces the challenging balancing act.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
While this is a much-needed clean chit to Israel, this could further rile up passions both within Gaza and in the wider Arab world. Biden's language in Tel Aviv is significantly different from what he's been saying for the first 10 days since this war began. The United States has a long-standing commitment to support Israel's right to self-defense. Simultaneously, it is also trying to restrain Israel from striking civilian targets like hospitals. It is also a blanket violation of the Geneva Conventions, which govern the rules of war, specifically clauses 18 and 19, which explicitly bar countries from targeting hospitals which have civilian populations receiving treatment. Tragically, this is not the first time that civilian targets have been hit in conflicts between Israel and Palestine. In the past, too, there have been instances where civilians were deliberately or even inadvertently targeted, resulting in significant international outcry. In past conflicts, civilians have been tragically targeted, leading to dire consequences as well. One glaring example is the 2014 Israel-Gaza war, where Israeli airstrikes hit residential areas. It also hit schools and hospital buildings, all of which resulted in significant civilian casualties. And these actions grew global condemnation back then. It damaged Israel's international image. It also prompted calls for investigations into potential war crimes. Eventually, Israel had to pull out of that war. In response, Hamas too has launched indiscriminate rocket attacks, endangering Israeli civilian populations. Now, the world is increasingly calling for a more humane approach in this long-standing conflict. There are growing demands for the cessation of attacks on civilians and for the protection of innocent lives in the region. The hospital strike only intensifies these cries for a more compassionate and just resolution, which can only be through the two-state solution. Also, in the last 10 days since this war began, and perhaps because of the brutality of the images of Israeli civilians being attacked, some of them taken hostage, elderly, women and children, Israel got a carte blanche of sorts from its allies, its friends and partners, countries from the United States, countries in Europe, and even partners like India were emphatically and resolutely sympathizing with Israel, to the extent of saying that Israel can do what it deems fit in its self-defense. That blank check now seems to have run out. This particular attack on the al-ahli hospital could be a turning point in the change of narrative, that there have to be guardrails in Israel's response, that they can't attack civilian populations, that they can't target hospitals. This is something that is going to be clearly spelled out by the international community, by the US President, by the United Nations Security Council, and by Israel's friends and partners, howsoever outraged it might be in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks. The hospital incident may also throw a wrench into Israel's planned ground offensive in Gaza. The global outrage and the condemnation could possibly influence the decision of Israel's leadership and its military planners. In the face of international pressure, they may have to reconsider the scope as well as the targets in this ground invasion. The situation is dire, and all eyes are on delicate diplomacy at this stage. President Biden, who had hoped to mediate peace, now faces the challenge of maintaining a delicate balance between Israel's need to defend itself and the threat of a spillover into civilian targets. He must, and he does, and will support resolutely Israel's security and security needs, while at the same time advocating for the protection of Palestinian civilians. In this time of crisis, the world watches with bated breath as the United States seeks to navigate these treacherous waters with the help of the United Nations Security Council and its friends and partners to try and rein Israel back, to at least put guardrails in its ground offensive against the Gaza Strip. It is a somber reminder also of the urgent need for a peaceful resolution to this long-standing question of Israel and Palestine. The resolution has to be one that prioritizes human lives and dignity above any territorial claims. As tensions persist in the Middle East, the prospect of a two-front war involving Israel is a topic of grave concern. The Israeli government has consistently strived to maintain readiness for all kinds of security scenarios. Now, as Israeli defense forces ready themselves for an imminent ground invasion of Gaza, and that too from the northern side of Gaza, they also have to brace themselves for the prospect of facing Hezbollah from the Israel-Lebanon border. Israel had warned more than 1 million Gazans in the north of the Strip to evacuate to the south, which the United Nations said could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe just last week. But now, this situation could get complicated if Hezbollah gets involved from the north. Now, this is similar to what happened in 2006 in the Israel-Lebanon war, when Hezbollah fired thousands of rockets, in a sense contributing to some of the factors that led to Israel withdrawing from Gaza. It is essential to analyze the evolution of Hezbollah, its arsenal, its military prospects, and also the potential consequences of such a conflict if it became a two-front war. The 2006 Israel-Lebanon war serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that Israel faces when it's confronted on two hostile fronts. During that conflict, more than 10 years ago, Hezbollah launched approximately 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, causing significant physical damage as well as civilian casualties. Since then, Hezbollah has significantly enhanced its armed capabilities. Various estimates suggest that Hezbollah may now possess up to 150,000 rockets, including medium and long-range rockets. Hezbollah's rocket arsenal comprises a mix of indigenous as well as made in Iran and made in Russia weaponry. They have modified Iranian-made Fajr 3 and Fajr 5 rockets, increasing their range and their payload capacity. Some of these medium-range rockets can now strike targets at over 150 kilometers distance. These modifications have also expanded Hezbollah's ability to strike deeper into Israeli territory, and that increases the vulnerability of northern Israeli towns. Furthermore, Hezbollah's acquisition of Russian-made weapons like the anti-tank guided missiles and anti-aircraft system, including the RPG-29 Vampires, the 84 Spigots, and the 5 Spandrels, has bolstered its military capabilities. Iran's role in a two-front war is also of utmost concern. Iran has long supported Hezbollah both financially and militarily. In the event of a major conflict, then Iran would actively back Hezbollah, and that would escalate the situation into a regional war. Such a development would have profound implications for the entire Middle East. It could potentially lead to a broader conflict involving other regional actors. It could cause instability and insecurity. In response to Iran's potential involvement, Israel would also likely seek to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities, and they'll have to do it swiftly. This could mean preemptive strikes on Hezbollah, particularly their positions in the border between Israel and Lebanon, and that could further exacerbate tensions in that region. The international community would face a daunting challenge in trying to prevent the escalation of hostilities and also mitigating the humanitarian consequences. Over the past week, since tensions began between Israel and Hamas, there were two major incidents at the Israel-Lebanon border. There was a false alarm of a drone swarm within days of the beginning of this war. There were also more than 40 rockets fired into northern Israel from Lebanon over the weekend in order to try and put the brakes on its ground operation. But fundamental to this problem is addressing the question of whether Arab states can afford a regional war. The Arab-Israeli wars, which were predominantly between 1948 and 1973, demonstrated the immense human and economic costs of such conflicts. These wars have not only claimed countless lives, but they've also diverted precious resources away from critical domestic needs. The last full-scale Arab-Israeli war happened in 1973. It's known as the Yom Kippur War or the October War. It ended with a ceasefire and the signing of the Camp David Accords of 1978, which led to peace between Egypt and Israel in 1979. That formal peace treaty between Cairo and Tel Aviv, the largest Arab state by population and the only Jewish state in the world, has held by and large for the last 50 years. This latest terrorist incident happened almost to the day of the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Subsequent negotiations after 1973, like the Oslo Accords of 92 and 93 and the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty in 1994, have further helped in holding the peace. Add to that the 2020 Abraham Accords between Israel, the UAE and Bahrain. It has got to a point where Arab states have now generally preferred diplomacy over warfare in recent times because they acknowledge the very high costs of war. However, a two-front war involving Israel and Hezbollah with potential Iranian involvement could test this commitment to diplomacy by Arab countries. Many Arab states would likely face pressure from their domestic constituents and also their regional allies. And their response would depend on the evolving circumstances of this war between Israel and Hamas, and possibly, if it became a two-front war, between Israel and Lebanon as well. Israel's readiness for this two-front war against Gaza from the north, while facing Hezbollah from Lebanon, is a multifaceted challenge. Hezbollah's significantly improved rocket arsenal, it's combined with its modified Iranian-made rockets and Russian-made weaponry, all of this poses a severe threat to Israel's north. The potential involvement of Iran in such a conflict would lead to a wider regional war, and that could have profound consequences for the entire Middle East. The Arab states, having experienced the very high costs of past conflicts, would face a difficult choice. Diplomacy and international intervention would remain essential to prevent a catastrophic escalation of hostilities, as also to maintain peace and stability in the Middle East. Something that has held, by and large, all right over the last 50 years, now has the prospects of being dismantled. And therein lies the big risk, not just for Israel, but also its Arab neighbors.
Presented by
في وسع Words fail me. Tonight, hundreds of people were killed horrifically in a massive strike at al-ahli Arab Hospital in Gaza City, including patients, healthcare workers and families that had been seeking refuge in and around the hospital. Once again, the most vulnerable. This is totally unacceptable. At least 6 people were also killed this afternoon when an UNRWA school was hit in al-Maghazi refugee camp in Gaza's middle area. The school had been serving as a shelter for some 4,000 people seeking refuge. Hospitals are sacrosanct, and they must be protected at all costs. We don't yet know the full scale of this carnage, but what is clear
Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Day 12, a hospital in Gaza has been attacked. 500 people have died. Hamas says Israel did it. Israel says Palestinian Jihad did it, and they have proof. Joe Biden says his Defense Department has data to show that Israel did not do it. The Arab world says it was Israel. Their people are protesting. Honestly, without an independent investigation, it's hard to tell. But we can tell you about the repercussions. The attack has whipped up passions.